Before every empire falls, there's a sound. It's not an explosion, it's a whisper. The sound of faith fading. Confidence. That's where every currency begins and ends. Not in gold, not in GDP, not even in guns. The true backbone of any currency is belief. When people believe that a dollar has value, it moves mountains. It builds empires, wins wars, feeds billions. But when that belief begins to crack, just slightly, everything else follows like dominoes. History has seen this pattern before. Rome's denarius, France's livre, Britain's pound. Each one collapsed not because the metal ran out, but because the people's faith in it did. Today, the US dollar stands on the same precipice. For nearly a century, it's been the world's currency of confidence. The promise written on every note, "In God we trust," might as well say, "In credit we trust." Because modern money isn't printed, it's promised. But promises, like empires, are only as strong as the belief behind them. In 1971, the world witnessed the first crack. President Nixon closed the gold window, severing the dollar's tie to gold. It was supposed to be temporary. It never reopened. The dollar was no longer a claim on anything real, only on the full faith and credit of the United States. And for decades, that faith held strong. The world believed in America's stability, its productivity, its power. But belief is fragile. Slowly, it began to shift. Global debt skyrocketed. The Federal Reserve printed trillions. The middle class felt the ground eroding beneath their feet. What once felt infinite now feels uncertain. That's the first stage of collapse. Confidence. The invisible stage. The moment when people don't say they've lost faith, but they start acting like they have. Quietly moving money offshore, buying gold, holding Bitcoin, asking questions they never asked before. And that's the danger. Confidence never collapses all at once. It evaporates quietly like morning fog. When confidence begins to fade, something curious happens. We start borrowing from the future to protect the present. That's how every empire survives its first tremor. Not by facing the truth, but by delaying it. Credit is faith multiplied. It's the belief that tomorrow will be strong enough to pay for today. And for a time, it works beautifully. After 1971, America entered the golden age of credit. No longer tied to gold, the dollar became infinite, and so did debt. The system learned to thrive on promises. Banks lent more, governments spent more, consumers consumed more. The machine roared to life. But underneath that roar was a hum of warning. The more we borrowed, the more fragile our belief became. The dollar wasn't just money anymore, it was a story. And that story depended on everyone continuing to play their part. Every empire learns this lesson the same way, through illusion. Rome debased its silver, France printed assonance, Britain stretched its colonies to fund wars. America? It outsourced its production, imported inflation, and exported dollars. It worked because the world still trusted the story. The dollar was king, and credit was its army. But credit is a double-edged sword. The same mechanism that creates prosperity also creates dependency. The moment growth slows, the debts remain, demanding to be fed. By the early 2000s, credit had become the new currency. Mortgages, student loans, corporate bonds, derivatives, layers upon layers of borrowed belief. The system wasn't built on gold anymore. It was built on the assumption that tomorrow would always be bigger than today. And then, in 2008, that illusion cracked. The credit system, this grand symphony of trust, had missed a note. Banks fell, markets froze, and suddenly the entire world realized how thin the foundation really was. The government stepped in, printed trillions, and confidence returned. For a while. But something changed. The people saw behind the curtain. They understood that money could be created with a keystroke, that the system wasn't sacred, it was synthetic. And when people see how the magic trick works, it never feels magical again. This is the second stage. Credit. The era of borrowed time and borrowed faith. It's when nations stop earning their power and start financing it, when growth becomes an illusion, sustained by debt. And like every illusion, it only lasts until the audience stops clapping. Collapse never begins with chaos. It begins with silence, the kind that settles in when everyone knows something is wrong, but no one dares to say it. By the time an empire realizes it's collapsing, it's already too late. The wheels are still turning, the lights are still on, but the engine beneath has seized. For the dollar, that silence began in the 2020s. The printing presses roared louder than ever, but this time, the noise didn't inspire confidence. It provoked suspicion. Trillions appeared from thin air, and people started asking, what is this paper really worth? Governments called it stimulus. Economists called it quantitative easing. But history calls it something else. Desperation. Because when a nation begins to create money faster than it creates value, collapse becomes not a question of if, but when. Inflation rose, but wages didn't. The cost of living climbed higher than the promise of the American dream. Every generation before believed that hard work could buy a better tomorrow. But now, tomorrow costs more than people can afford. And when the people stop believing in tomorrow, the story ends. The dollar, once a symbol of stability, became a mirror reflecting the cracks of the world it built. The same system that lifted millions from poverty began consuming itself. The empire of debt turned inward. Foreign nations noticed. Trade partners whispered about alternatives. BRICS built new systems. China, Russia, and others began to settle oil in other currencies. For the first time in a century, the world dared to imagine life beyond the dollar. And the US did what every empire in decline does. It tried to preserve power by force, not faith. Sanctions replaced diplomacy. Threats replaced trust. But power without belief is just noise. History tells us this moment always comes. The Roman denarius lost its silver. The French assignat became worthless. The British pound ceded its throne to the dollar. And now, the dollar faces the same fate. Not because of enemies, but because of entropy. No empire collapses in a single night. It decays slowly, through complacency, through arrogance, through the quiet erosion of trust. And yet, collapse is not only destruction, it's also revelation. When the illusion dies, truth returns. The truth that value is never in paper or digits. It was always in people, in productivity, in the real things we create and exchange. So when the dollar finally falls, whether next year or next decade, it won to be the end of money. It will be the end of pretending. Because what collapses is not just a currency, but a story. A story that began in confidence, expanded through credit, and ended, inevitably, in collapse. And in that silence, as the world searches for something new to believe in, the question will echo again. What is money, really? And more importantly, who do we trust now? Every collapse leaves a silence. But inside that silence, something begins to move. When Rome fell, it wasn't the end of civilization. It was the end of arrogance. Out of the ashes, new systems rose, smaller, humbler, closer to the truth of human need. When the British Empire waned, the world didn't stop spinning. It simply shifted its gravity. A new power, the United States, stepped into the vacuum. And when the dollar collapses, the same pattern will repeat. Because history isn't a straight line. It's a cycle. Confidence, credit, collapse, faith, illusion, revelation. It keeps turning until we finally learn what value really means. But this time, the change feels different. It's faster, more connected, more digital. We're not waiting for kings or governments to define our value anymore. We're recreating it. The rise of cryptocurrency, decentralized finance, digital gold, these aren't just technologies. They're psychological revolutions. They represent something ancient wrapped in something new, the desire to reclaim trust from the few and return it to the many. For generations, we outsourced faith to banks, to states, to printed promises. We believed because we were told to. But when that belief finally broke, people began to ask the most powerful question of all. What if we build a system that doesn't need trust because it's built on truth? That's where humanity stands today, on the edge of an awakening. The collapse of the dollar isn't just an economic event, it's a mirror. A reflection of everything we've avoided, our addiction to debt, our worship of growth, our fear of change. And yet, there's something profoundly human about it. Every generation must confront its illusion before it can evolve. Every civilization must watch its gods fall before it can find new meaning. Maybe that's what this collapse really is. Not an ending, but a cleansing. A painful return to something real. Because buried beneath all the numbers, the policies, the crises, is a truth that never collapses. That value is born from human effort, not from printed promises. Empires rise on belief. They fall on excess. But humanity rises again every single time. So here we stand, staring at the edge of history. The dollar's empire, built on confidence, inflated by credit, is beginning to tremble. The cracks are visible, the whispers growing louder. And maybe, just maybe, this isn't a tragedy. Maybe it's a test. Because the real question is not what happens to the dollar. It is what happens after. What comes next when faith in money itself disappears? When people no longer trust what S written on paper or what S stored in a bank? Will we rebuild a system rooted in truth, transparent, decentralized, fair? Or will we repeat the same cycle under a new name, a new illusion, another promise destined to break? That's the open chapter of our time. The collapse of the dollar isn't the end of history. It's the moment we realize we were living inside a story, and now we get to write the next one.